Hello, it's Chloe here from World Have Your Say. Thank you for downloading our podcast for the programme on Friday, the 15th of July, 2016, where we spent the entire hour today looking at that lorry attack in Nice. We heard some really harrowing eyewitness accounts from two people who spent yesterday evening on that promenade, both of whom, by real luck, weren't in the area where the lorry hit at that exact moment. They had both moved inside two restaurants, and they were saying to me separately that they felt that was what had saved their lives. So that was the first sort of 15 minutes of the programme. And then after that, we spoke to a number of terrorism and security experts about how France moves forward from this. Is there a way to protect France from this kind of attack? And also looking at intelligence and security. Were there failures in that? Because, of course, it very much seems now, as more information emerges about the driver of that lorry, that he really was unknown to the intelligence services. So was there any way to stop him? Now, if you'd like to see our terms of use, please head to bbc.co.uk/terms. Here's today's programme. Hello, welcome to World Have Your Say. Chloe Tilley live with you for the next hour. And we're going to spend the entire programme today talking about the truck which drove at high speed into a crowd of thousands of people celebrating Bastille Day in Nice last night. 84 people have died, including 10 children. 50 people are fighting for their lives in hospital. Well, details are still emerging, but French prosecutors have said in the last hour or so that the driver was a 31-year-old French-Tunisian man who lived in Nice. Mohamed Boulel was divorced, he had children, and he was convicted earlier this year of a road rage incident, but he wasn't known to the security services. Well, last night he drove that lorry, swerving from side to side through the crowds for around 2 kilometres. Now, in a moment, we'll play you two conversations I had a little earlier on with people who were there at the time of the attack. But also, throughout the course of the hour, we're going to discuss how France can protect itself and whether there were any intelligence failings. Well, let's have a listen now to a conversation I had with Vaughan a few hours ago. He was there last night with his wife, Natalie, and they both witnessed the attack on that promenade.
Well, what happened was we had really bad service in the restaurant because there were so many people, because it was a holiday and everyone wanted to, watch the fireworks. So, we were on a restaurant on the Promenade d'Anglais, and when the fireworks started around 10 o'clock, we got up and left our table to go outside and walk across the promenade to in front of the Blue Beach. And we watched the fireworks. And when the fireworks ended about, 20 minutes to 11 or so, because we hadn't eaten yet, we immediately walked back across the street to the restaurant. And when we sat back down at the table, then, this big white truck who was driving kind of slowly down the promenade, all of a sudden, jumped the curb and went up on the sidewalk, started killing people. And had we not had poor service, I asked myself today, maybe there is a guardian angel, because we would have been right where the truck was, and maybe something bad would have happened to us. But initially, within the first 5 or 6 seconds of the truck going up on the pedestrian way, people were in awe. I think everybody kind of thought it was something of an accident. Somebody had lost control. And then, as soon as it registered in their mind and the truck continued down the pedestrian way, killing people and injuring people, and shortly thereafter, gunshots were being fired. The people dispersed. I mean, it was a crazy scene. People were yelling and running and in all different directions, trying to get away from the mayhem. And bless my wife's heart, instead of running away, we ran back across the street from the restaurant to try to help the people that were injured. And my wife stayed with a couple of very, very badly injured women, trying to console them before, they could be taken to the hospital. And the people that really need to be thanked, because there were so many injured. I mean, it was a horror. It was a war zone. The real heroes of the night were the pompiers, the firemen, because there was very few medical people on the scene, and the people that were helping all the injured were the firemen, trying to do triage and keep the blood from flowing, because there were dead people people and badly injured people, and we kept asking, where are the ambulances? Where are the ambulances? And one of the firemen said, there's 100 people injured. They're everywhere. Our group that was hit in front of the Blue Beach were probably 12 or 13 people that were knocked down and either killed, and there were 2 children, and people were dead, and they were covering them up with tablecloths, and it was just a scene out of some bad war movie. It was just horrible. It's impossible to describe the carnage. It was incredible that a truck could just do the mayhem that they did. It was just horrible.
And that scene that you describe of so many people lying there dead and injured, and the heroism of those firefighters, and as you say, your wife helping those women. Does she know how those women are? Did they survive?
Well, the women that she had one hand on one and one hand on the other, and they both, one was bleeding profusely, and the other one her leg was completely ripped apart. I mean, you could see the bone and her foot was hanging on by the skin. It was just horrible, and I think they both got to the hospital, and the condition of the 2 ladies, we really don't know right now, but the one lady's name was Faith, and if they list a name of the survivors, maybe there's a way we could find this one woman, but it was just horrible. And there was one civilian doctor, a lady, in all white, but it was a white dress, a summer dress, that she was just magnificent. I mean, she just helped everybody. For sure, she was a doctor or like an emergency room nurse, because she was going around to the different people. Like I said, in our group, there was about 13 injured or dead. 2 or 3 were dead, and she was trying to stop the blood flow. I mean, it was like a river of blood. I mean, it was just horrible. You just never seen anything like it before. It's just hard to describe.
And how are you coping now, several hours on? I guess you're starting to process what you've witnessed and the trauma of it all.
Well, what people don't realize is that for every person that was knocked down, either injured or killed, there was 1 or 2 or 3 of their family that were on the sidewalks crying and in pain and agony. I mean, it was not only the injured or the dead that people need to realize were part of this tragedy. It was their loved ones that survived that were devastated. I mean, it was difficult to look at the people that had the loved ones either dead or injured, and people don't talk about those people. It was more horrifying than the people that were injured. I mean, it was crazy. It was just the grief.
Well, that was Vaughan speaking to me a few hours ago. He was out last night eating with his partner, Natalie, and he shared his story with us. I also spoke to a lady called Edleen. She was with her sister. She was also having dinner on that promenade, and let's listen to her story.
The restaurant was already pretty jam-packed, and it's literally on the front of the promenade, right in front of where the fireworks display was happening. Everybody clapped at the end of the fireworks display and kind of carried on, about people's business. Some people looked like they were walking back to their accommodation, but there was still a lot of people out on the street. We again were kind of at our table and began to notice people running just past the front of the restaurant, and we thought, oh God, what is going on here? Initially, and I'll be honest, I didn't really register what was happening. I saw people running but didn't think anything of it. And then obviously the volume of people increased, and we started to hear gunshots and people screaming. So at that point, my sister just started screaming, get out and run. And so literally we kind of pushed out of the restaurant. I grabbed my handbag from under the table because I was cognizant of the fact that I had the 2 communicative tools, as in the 2 mobile telephones, and also the keys to our Airbnb, which was literally on the road around the corner, so it wasn't even a block in terms of where we were staying. So we went out of a side entrance of the restaurant and in essence started to fly around the corner running, all 4 of us. The 2 friends we were with were kind of slightly in front. My sister was at the back. As I ran with my handbag, obviously not having time to close it or anything, the 2 mobile phones then flew out. In a split second, they'd kind of flown into the middle of the road, and obviously my sister then kind of ran ahead, and I decided if I didn't grab the phones, we'd have no means of communicating with anyone in the outside world or knowing what actually had happened. So, literally dive down, grab them, and then my sister she turned around and she'd stopped to kind of wait for me, and I could see the sheer panic in her eyes as she just screamed, "Run, run, run," and the gunshots were obviously getting closer. As we were running, I obviously was literally diving into my bag to get the keys out, and in essence we did a relay race. So luckily both of us used to be athletes in younger life, and ran. Literally I handed her the keys forward, she had her hand back, and she then sprinted ahead to open the gate. As we were running past, a lot of people were speaking French and asking in French, do you have a key? Is there anywhere safe? And my sister speaks French, luckily, and our accommodation has sort of grilled gates, like I suppose, traditional French grilled gates on the road. And so my sister had the key, opened it, and as we opened the gate, and obviously loads of people just flooded in with us, we then had to run to the next door. And again, obviously, in that time of stress, you're not going to shut people out. So we had a couple come in who had a baby in a pushchair, young people, old people, and we were all sort of running in. Our accommodation was on the top floor of the building, so in essence, my sister was just screaming, "Just get into the lift. We need to just get into the accommodation and lock the doors." Once the four of us of our group got into the lift, we noticed there was another lady who had kind of run in with us, obviously a complete stranger, a Polish lady. And my sister then said to her, because she was visibly shaking, as were all of we, "What language do you speak?" And she said English, and she said, "Is it okay if I come with you?" And we said, "Of course." So we came back into our accommodation, into the flat, and obviously in essence just bunkered down, turned off all the lights, completely silent, bolted the doors, because at that point we obviously didn't know what was going on. We didn't know if there was a gunman on the loose. It had been so close that we thought actually he could have run into the building with us and we would have been none the wiser. We just knew nothing. As we sat kind of all together in one room, huddled and just kind of praying for the best, we were obviously trying to check the phones to see if there was any news, and there was no news coming in probably for about 15, 20 minutes. And in the meantime, we also were contacting the outside world, and we were hearing people screaming and hearing people running, and hearing sirens, and obviously we knew nothing. And then finally the information began to trickle through.
I guess you didn't know at that point whether this was one person or a group of people.
And I think that's exactly it, and especially because we weren't getting the news feed quickly. I think at that point we were thinking, right, okay, we've let people in, which is obviously the right thing to do, but actually could any of these people be the person who's going to turn around us and shoot us, in a split second? Number two, we don't know if it's one gunman. We don't know if there are multiple gunmen. If there are multiple gunmen, is the next thing going to be to bomb this building? Again, as I mentioned, we came to the top floor. So, and because we're on the next road, I was thinking if they bomb the top floor, we're not going to, we can't jump. We'll die if we jump. So whether we stay in the building and the building gets blown up or we jump, we're going to die. And I think in those moments, it was just a case of this literally could be it for all of us.
Were there many police around before it all kicked off? Because so many people have been talking about this huge gathering of thousands of people. And how was it this lorry was able to get there? Was there a police presence in the evening, in the hours and the minutes before the attack?
So do you know what was really crazy? As I said, we went out earlier in the afternoon, which was when we selected the restaurant. And one of the comments that we made were like, God, we have never seen such heightened security. There were police, there were military, there were people in Navy suits, and we were saying, God, how many people are they expecting? Because there seem to be so many kind of security, or people who you would think would provide security in that moment. There were army tanks, there were police cars, police with guns. So actually, we felt safe because of what we'd seen earlier in the day and because there were so many. I think obviously because they pedestrianised the area, what I imagine would have happened was, in essence, it was probably difficult for the police themselves to get in to stop this truck. So, yeah, in terms of the presence earlier in the day and what we'd seen prior, it looked like there were, more than enough police and we were more than safe.
Well, that was Edleen speaking to me a few hours ago. She was out with her sister and some friends having dinner on that promenade in Nice last night, just as the lorry attack began. Well, let me introduce you to a couple of guests who are with us now to give us a perspective from here in the UK and also another one from South Africa. Martin Iwi is in Pretoria, counter-terrorism expert from the Institute of Security Studies in South Africa. And here opposite me in the World Have Your Say studio, Afzal Ashraf, who is a counter-insurgency and security expert at the Royal United Service Services Institute here in London. Afzal Ashraf, first of all, let's pick up on that point that Edleen made there about the huge amount of security that was in Nice. Is there ever a way to prevent an attack like this?
No, there isn't a way of complete security. What you can do, and what people do fairly successfully, is reduce the risk. The point I think we should always remember is this, that terrorists have a huge number of potential targets. They have many means of attacking people, but there's only one motivation. And so if we are to address this curse of terrorism, we need to put our main effort in attacking that singular motivation, whilst doing whatever we can to cover any security lapses that we identify, any areas that we identify, to make life difficult for the terrorists without encroaching unnecessarily on the lifestyles of our people, whether they're in France, whether they're in the UK or anywhere else.
I mean, some people were looking at the footage last night, the very strong footage of that lorry moving along, because, of course, we live in this social media age where everybody's filming things. And some people scratching their heads saying, with thousands of people gathering, was this not an obvious target? How was a lorry able to get through to those people when there was such a high security presence and so many families all gathered in one place?
Well, I think that question will hopefully be answered in the next few days when there is an investigation. But the point we must remember is this, that any event where there is a large gathering, and we have many of those at any particular time throughout the world, throughout various cities, there will be a point at which traffic restrictions, if they're in place for security, have to be lifted. And according to some reports at least, this attack took place after the fireworks display, when people were presumably preparing to go home. So I think, again, we mustn't beat ourselves or try and point a finger of blame until we know the facts, because every time we talk in terms of a security failure, what we are also unintentionally doing is painting this particular carnage as a success for the terrorists. And we must be very careful about that. I'm sure lessons will be learned, but we mustn't set up the expectation that there is such a thing as complete security. And we must be a bit more reasonable, I think, about the way we approach any lessons that are learned.
Before we bring in Martin Iwi from South Africa, just sitting down in the World Have You Say studio, Olivia Gita, who's a counter-terrorism specialist and managing director at Global Strat, which is an international security risk firm. Your thoughts, your reflections on what happened yesterday?
Unfortunately, I was not surprised. This is something that we've been expecting. The fact that nothing happened during the Euro was linked to the fact that the two cells that would have potentially attacked the Euro 2016 were dismantled in Paris and Brussels. But as I said, there was so much emphasis and focus on bringing security to the Euro that some other areas were left unopened. And targeting, I was in Paris last week and security was still very tight. I suspect that in Nice, there may have been a little sigh of relief and a little bit of lack of security.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because just before you came in, because I appreciate you're rushing all around the building here at the BBC doing interviews and what have you, and we heard from a lady I spoke to a few hours ago, Edleen, and she said that before the attack happened, she was really surprised at the high levels of security there. She described it as seeing police, military men and people in navy suits, and she really felt that they were taking it very seriously and security was very high. And yet you see those videos that people are sharing of the lorry driving along and two police officers seemingly trying to shoot the suspect before he gets to the crowd. How did it get that far?
Well, as your previous guest mentioned, is totally right. Well, the investigation will look into this. And it will be pure speculation on my part.
But for example, I guess what I'm getting at is if you walk around the Houses of Parliament in London, there are massive concrete slabs all in front of it, so there can't be any suicide attacks to keep people away. Would that be so difficult to do at an event like last night, or am I being completely impractical here?
You're not being impractical. I mean, that's one of the things that should possibly have been done, but it's all in hindsight. I think the main issue to look at this is security services were really on the lookout for an attack on Bastille Day. I mean, jihadists are looking at symbolical targets, symbolical dates, and basically to shake down the French state the day of its national holiday is really meaningful. So that's one thing. The second thing is we had intel from German security services a few weeks back that Islamic State would try to target the south of France, Italy and Spain, but mostly beach resorts in a redux, if you will, of the attack in Sousse in Tunisia that killed 30 UK citizens. Because of the modus operandi that we've seen yesterday, that has been called for by the spokesman of Islamic State, Al-Adnani, since September 2014, using cars as weapons. There were 4 attacks in France in the past 18 months of jihadists using cars. They were not very well publicized for obvious reasons. But I think that it was not a surprise. The surprise, as you mentioned, is how in hell that truck got in. But we'll know soon enough.
And also reflections from both of you on why particularly France, because it's not just France that is engaged in military action against so-called Islamic State.
I think that I don't see that you can practically seal off a beach resort the size of Nice in the same way as you can seal off particular targets such as the Houses of Parliament and so on. And I think that if we even think about going down that route, then what we're doing is investing in a huge amount of infrastructure which will allow the terrorists to go elsewhere. When do you stop investing in this? There's nothing stopping a terrorist from doing this thing at bus stations where people are waiting for buses and elsewhere. I think that we need to go back to the basic point that the terrorists have a huge number of potential targets. They have many means of attacking those targets, but they have only one motivation.
So are they targeting France more than elsewhere, or is it just that other countries are better at preventing the attacks?
The only thing about France is this, that France has a greater number of foreign fighters in Syria than elsewhere, than other European countries. And of course, Tunisia has the largest number of foreign fighters in Syria. And so where you have this coincidence of a Tunisian national living in France, you have perhaps a statistical probability which is greater than elsewhere. But I think at this stage it's too early to hypothesize based on the limited information that we have. France has had more attacks.
But they've had more attacks, haven't they? They've had 3 major terrorist attacks within 18 months. And that is more than any other European country. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear from the past 30 years that France has been really in the middle of the jihadist war. I mean, you go back to the 1990s, the GIA, the Algerian group, had attacks in France, in public stores, in the Champs-Élysées, but not in that scale. But you are correct. France, for many reasons, including domestic and foreign relations reasons, has been viewed as the number one target for Islamic State, even ahead of the US.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that after the news. Martin, I do apologise, Martin Iwi, who's in Pretoria. Thank you for being so patient. We will come to you after the news. I know that Afzal Ashraf has to leave us now, but don't go anywhere. 30 minutes of conversation still to come here on World Have Your Say. Welcome back to World Have Your Say. Chloe Tilley live with you for the next 30 minutes. And France is trying to come to terms with the 3rd major terrorist attack in 18 months. A lorry driven at high speed into a crowd of thousands of men, women and children enjoying Bastille Day fireworks. At least 84 people have died, including 10 children. And we're hearing that 52 people are in a critical condition. 25 people are on life support and over 200 people have been injured. injured. And we've been hearing some incredibly harrowing accounts. People sharing stories online saying that the lorry deliberately targeted a children's carousel. Another person saying families with small children were telling them to shut their eyes as they tried to make their way through the bodies littering the roads in the minutes after the attack. Well, we're going to spend the next half an hour looking at what can be done, if anything, to prevent these types of attack, whether it be in France or indeed elsewhere, and also to discuss whether security and intelligence was sufficient or whether there were some failings. Well, just before the news, we were speaking to Olivier Gitter, who is a counter-terrorist specialist, managing director at Global Strat, which is an international security risk firm. He's sitting with me here in the World Have You Say studio. And Olivier, you were talking about the reasons why France was being targeted in your view. So do continue to make that point.
So a couple of the other reasons is obviously, as you mentioned, France's foreign policy and especially is very strong military engagement against jihadists has been viewed also as one of the main points of contention. Also, the jihadists view France as an Islamophobic country for some of the laws that were passed, including the ban on the burqa, and that should not be forgotten. It builds the narrative of Islamic State. And last point that I would make is that Islamic State, if you will, board includes two Frenchmen that have a strong desire to hit back at France. So that could explain why they would go after the French.
And if you look at the theme of people who have carried out these attacks in recent months, I mean, in this case, Mohamed Boulel, divorced, had children, had been involved with the police. There was a road rage incident, we understand French prosecutors were saying, but no intelligence of any terror links, all sort of low-level crime. And if you look at the theme, there seems to be that theme that these weren't people who were devoutly religious for years and years. These were people who drank and smoked and committed low-level crime. Do you see a link there?
Yes, but what I have to underline is that this specific case is totally different from others because, as you mentioned, it was not on the list of terrorists wanted by the French police, whereas all the perpetrators of the Bataclan and in Brussels were. But you are correct. There's a huge link between petty criminality and then jihad. Usually it happens in prison. Prison are really the tipping point. I saw this about 10 years ago, how, as you said, they used to be drinking, chasing girls. They go into prison, they find, quote-unquote, the religion, and then come out and join the jihad. So you are correct. But in this case, I think it's mind-boggling, and it's more scary than the other two attacks I would put to you, because it was almost impossible to find. You're talking about a needle in a haystack. This guy was even more than a needle in a haystack because there was no trace of him. And that's the scenario that security services have been thinking as their major nightmare for the past 15 years, not just in the past year.
Do stay with us. I'm just looking up at some of the TV screens here in the World Have You Say studio, and I can see that there is a service which has just begun at Nice Cathedral, paying tribute to the victims of the attack, those who died, but of course the many that are injured. Let's have a listen. See lots of people sitting down, taking part in that service at Nice Cathedral. And so often when we discuss these kind of tragedies on World Have You Say, people talk about the need to come together and to have a focal point for their grief. And this is, of course, an opportunity for people there to gather and to show their thoughts, their commitment to the people in their city who have suffered so much over the last 24 hours. Olivier Gitter is going to stay with us here in the studio. I want to bring in a couple of other people who are here to talk with us and really pick up on that point of the kind of the needle in the haystack and how you find an individual like that to really pin down the threat that is posed to French society. Jason Wiseman is a counter-terrorism expert and secretary of the Atlantic Treaty Association. He's on the line from Brussels. And Martin Iwi is in Pretoria in South Africa, counter-terrorism expert from the Institute of Security Studies. Jason, first of all, that needle in a haystack that we heard there from Olivia, is there any way to find somebody who is so completely off the radar before they commit an atrocity like this?
Well, first I want to say thank you for having me, because this really is a tragic moment for France and her allies in coping with its ongoing struggle against terrorism and radicalization. And in relation to your question of needle in the haystack, well, there's always some indicators. I think that the key component that you always want to have is making sure that you have an ongoing engagement with your civil society. And that's promoting these shared values and internal stability so that you have the sort of key players within their societies and communities communicating to local and federal authorities. For example, something to watch out for is when someone like this stops going to the mosque, when someone like this all of a sudden is more active and radical in their engagement with their own community members.
Let's bring in Martin as well for a perspective from South Africa. I'm keen for the three of you to have a conversation about this. What are your thoughts, Martin?
Well, truly, it's a tragedy that has hit humanity, and I think that the whole world has to side with France on this. But I think that an attack of this nature could have been prevented, not entirely, but at least the magnitude would have been significantly reduced. What we see most often if you want to prevent a terrorist attack on such an event of this nature, because French independence is something that we all know terrorists will be fighting to carry out an attack, because it's going to be a historic attack for the terrorists themselves. I think what was missing was pre-intelligence, because if you had really done a robust pre-intelligence for the event, I'm sure you will have had some red flags somewhere which will have guided the way the physical security at the site will have been arranged and provided for citizens. Because now, even when you provide that security, you also have to have a second measure in terms of when people are leaving. Where would the threat come from? And then you also provide a different mode of security in that respect. We didn't see this in Nice. But again, I know that it's really difficult today to entirely prevent a terrorist attack, because the modus operandi we are seeing more and more is that terrorist organizations are resorting to individuals with clean record, because these are individuals that can get below the radar. There's nothing on them, no tag on them, and therefore it is a lot easier for such individuals to carry out an attack, to assess certain infrastructures or sites that a person with a track record of criminality will not be able to do. So, unfortunately, I think
Martin, hang on a moment, because Olivia is keen to pick up on a couple of points that you've made.
I agree with Martin on some of the points, but there's one thing that we have to look for in terms of soft targets and in terms of preventing such attacks, and the only thing that could happen is to get human intelligence ahead of time. And unfortunately, none of the countries in the West have worked a lot and invested a lot in human intelligence. I'm talking about infiltrating cells. I'm talking about the work that the French used to do in the 1990s and the 2000s that the UK and the US were jealous of, but that was basically getting Muslim informers to penetrate those cells, become one of them, and then give back the information.
So what changed?
President Sarkozy in 2008 decided on a whim that he wanted to integrate and merge different departments. So that department was scrapped. It was called les renseignements généraux. And since then, French intelligence has gone down because it has followed the model of the UK and the US, concentrating on electronic intelligence, getting electronic records rather than getting human intelligence.
Jason?
Well, I think the way is to prepare for the worst case scenarios, because the best way to be secure is to plan for the worst case scenario to make sure that you're not vulnerable in the first place.
I mean, you talked earlier, Olivier, about intelligence coming from Germany. How closely are European countries working together, sharing intelligence?
It could be better. It works well between, for instance, the French and the UK than between the French and the Belgian, for instance. It works very well between the Germans and the Americans and the French and the Americans. So it has to do with personal relationship. And that's what it's all about. It's not an institution. It's somebody that knows a colleague in London or Paris that pick up the phone and say, okay, I have tap on this person, is going to cross the channel tomorrow. Pick the tab on him and go after him. So the help is very meaningful, but the terrorists have known about this, and what they've done is, especially in the case of Brussels, specifically Islamic State told their followers to attack neighboring countries, not their home country, because they would fly under the radar. So, for instance, the cell from Brussels that came into Paris to perpetrate the attack were not on the French security services radar. They were on the Belgian ones. But the Belgian didn't share the information with the French.
Why, though? Why isn't that sharing happening in light of what's happened? Because there's been quite a lot of criticism, albeit from right-wing parties like Marine Le Pen, the leader of the Front National in France, saying, quite frankly, nothing has changed since those attacks in November, which shocked so many people. That there's been no, in her words, no reintroduction of double punishment, no depriving people of nationality, closing of Salafist mosques, no banning of certain organisations. She says, in truth, we're not at war for the moment. We're in a war of words. Why hasn't there been more action after these horrific attacks in the last 18 months?
Because when you look at it, first, I think they didn't take Charlie Hebdo seriously. I mean, they thought that it was just a targeted attack that, Al-Qaeda had Charlie Hebdo for a long, long time as their main target. So for them, that wasn't an issue. Attacking Jews, those military, police, crazy journalists and Jews are normal targets. So it's not the canary in the mine. November, things changed. So the legislation and counterterrorism laws have become much stronger. They've been, as much as possible, arresting and stopping imam from preaching in some mosques. But all in all, not a lot has changed indeed since November.
Jason, do you agree with that maybe after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, it wasn't taken seriously enough?
I think that the threat is being taken very seriously. I mean, living in Brussels, what you have seen is the country remain on threat level 3 out of 4 for months. You've seen the deployment of soldiers. You've seen a tremendous amount of overhaul, reinvestment in the monitoring and surveillance capabilities. And what you really are looking at needing more of is partnerships with your major metropolitan police departments. You need engagement with community organizations that can reach those that may be inclined towards violence. And you got to focus more of your resources on the convicted criminals already, ones who already have a history of petty crime.
We've heard a lot in the UK, because we're obviously at a heightened state in the UK, about plots being foiled. And there hasn't been an attack since July 2005. Is it a case that British intelligence is better than French? Is it because we're not part of Schengen, there's not free movement of people in quite the same way here? We're not part of Schengen, and there's a great channel that people have to get across. What's the difference?
A couple of points. I mean, in terms of stats, as I said, there are many more Frenchmen than British that have gone to Syria and Iraq. There's a real target, and France is number one target for Islamic State. I would say that Britain is down the food chain and a tier 1 country, but less so. And until December, until UK's involvement in Syria against Islamic State, I would say that they were tier 2. So having said that, the French also foil about one plot a month, so about the same than the Brits. But in terms of stats, if you try 100 times rather than 20 here, the chances of one attack going through is stronger.
Just coming into the World Have You Say studio, Marco Vicenzino, is that correct? A political risk analyst who is joining us to get involved in this conversation. You've heard a little bit of what we've talked about. Your thoughts on why this attack was able to happen?
I mean, obviously, from an immediate perspective, one has to question how wasn't that barriers weren't put up. It's a public place, a huge gathering. So I think that's a shortcoming on the part of whether it's local authorities, local police in Nice. I think that's yet to be determined. Why it took place or how it took place, I mean, obviously, right now, French authorities are overwhelmed. You have a lot of leads, a lot of suspects, and not enough resources to be able to address all of them. So when something falls through the cracks, obviously it's going to come down hard on the system. A lot of criticism, but the lone wolf concept. I mean, the lone wolf concept is going to be probably the most difficult for all of authorities, not just in France, but throughout Europe and the U.S. I mean, the attacks in the last year in the U.S., the big one in Orlando, 49 killed. We had San Bernardino, several killed there. And as a result, much was with these lone wolves. Now, the individual in Orlando was on the FBI radar screen, but he was not a suspect. But the case against him, the investigation was put aside, but he was still on their radar screen. So it's not that. So when you're overwhelmed by suspects, and particularly in France, also, I mean, and throughout the Schengen countries, passport-free travel throughout many countries on continental Europe, and when you have individuals going for training in Iraq and Syria, to go between Syria and Turkey, it's a fairly porous border. Then you have over 1 million of people in 2015, and also in 2014 you had coming through, exploiting the migration issue of over 1 million coming just in 2015 alone. There are obviously going to be elements that are going to exploit that situation, come through, get to one part of Europe, have several safe houses in different European cities, plan in different parts of Europe, and the collaboration and cooperation between authorities in Europe, I don't think, in my opinion, is where it should be. It's improved a lot in recent times for obvious reasons, the attacks, but it isn't where it should be. So there's a lot of gaps within the passport-free travel zone, and as a result, these individuals exploit those gaps.
Yes, I mean, I couldn't agree more, and that ties up in the fact that they can freely move and attack another country. The question comes down to really that you don't even have cooperation between services in the same country, as we've seen in Belgium. So, we're hoping that there's going to be cooperation between European countries. Look, the police in Malines was sitting on information where Abdeslam was since December. And because of jealousy between departments, the information was not spread out. I mean, this is ridiculous, but we go back to ego and issue of competition between departments.
I mean, this is not what the French people need to hear right now, because they must be utterly terrified, and you're constantly told, aren't you, not to change your behaviour, your pattern of behaviour, because then the idea of terrorism wins. However, surely the people in France are oh no, Marco disagrees with that.
Yeah, no, I'm saying is that it's important it's a difference between creating a state of fear and vigilance. Now, what I mean by that is, by vigilance is telling citizens, ordinary citizens, to adapt to new tactics in terms of responsibility, informing authorities. There needs to be greater public participation. You can call this a contract between ordinary citizens and authorities, greater cooperation and collaboration between the two. Ordinary citizens also have an obligation to ensure public safety. So, for example, if you're walking, you see strange behavior in the metros, suspicious behavior, you have to report that. Now, is all of it legitimate? Authorities can also be overwhelmed by small things that shouldn't be reported, but these are part of the realities. It's adapting to new realities. Vigilance, and I think there's a difference between vigilance and a state of fear.
Jason, were you trying to come in there?
Yeah, well, I would just say that I very much agree. I mean, resilience, civil preparedness, this is a huge component of addressing this threat. Huge. It's impossible to understate it. I mean, at the emergency response level, countries get it together. I mean, we're always being probed for weaknesses. This is of course normal on the case of our adversaries, but after the November attacks, the French authorities, they shut down mosques, they raided over 2,000 homes and buildings, they took over 230 people into custody, and they seized over 330 weapons. And the Minister of Interior stated that in 15 days, they seized 1/3 of the quantity of war-grade weapons that are normally seized in a year. And in the case of Belgium, when they raised it to threat level 4, they deployed over 500 soldiers and 1,000 police officers that were to monitor, preserve, and protect high-value civilian targets like metro lines, hotels, shopping centers, movie theaters, and so on. And, on November 19th, the Prime Minister announced that an additional 400 million euros would be allocated by the government for security in the fight against terrorism.
But the problem is you're talking about engaging communities and getting them to talk to the authorities. But you're also talking about, in Belgium, in France, disaffected youth, huge numbers in communities where they don't feel that there's a complete disconnect. They don't feel that they can go to the authorities. They don't want to talk to the authorities. If you're talking about Muslim communities, some of them don't even trust the authorities. So how do you bridge that gap?
With tremendous patience, you really need to make a tremendous amount of effort to engage the civil society. I mean, this is the only way. This is one area in which the Atlantic Treaty Association is very engaged in, because if you don't have people within the community feeding you information, you've got nothing. There's no way to get ahead. There's no way to be on top of this. In addition to this, you have to cope with the fact that there's a tremendous amount of technological resources that a lot of these guys are using to stay in contact and off the radar. They're using browsers like Tor. They're using messenger apps like Telegram that allow them to be completely anonymous. And in a city like Brussels, it's easy to be anonymous in this city. It's too easy. And as a result, if you don't have neighbors and imams and a lot of civil society leaders and respected members of the community cooperating with your local and federal police forces, you cannot get ahead. It really is that simple.
Yeah, in many of these neighborhoods, you have a sense of exclusion. I mean, it's like a fortress mentality, and you have to break down these psychological barriers. And it's based upon building something called trust. And trust, as I agree with a colleague, it takes time. That takes not just months, it can take years. And trust can be broken. It takes a long time to build, but it can be broken very easily. And then there's also the issue of threat perceptions, the perceptions of how one views the other. If there's been no interaction, if for an entire life someone has grown up in a specific neighborhood in a specific area, and every time he ventures out for it, he's treated in a certain way, that's going to enforce that fortress mindset and mentality that no matter what I do, I'll always be stuck here. And then obviously that is grievances. Those grievances, they accumulate over time, and to the time does that begin slowly that road to radicalization. Then you have people telling you things, preachers, whatever it be, or influential members of society talking to you about certain narrative, victimization, and then the whole narrative builds up. And you get groups like the jihadists, like ISIS, for example, have a very compelling narrative, very simple but compelling narrative, use amazing technology, Hollywood-like technology in their videos. So for someone who's already vulnerable in many ways, they become somewhat, I won't say natural recruits, but they become much more susceptible.
Let me jump in and put something in perspective. What I think is important for your audience to remember is that we've gone backwards. Because I can tell you, growing up in France 30 years ago, we didn't have all those problems. So we've had a generation that was, very, very well tied up with no major problems. And then we had the influence of extremists, as Marco mentioned, extremist preachers coming into the banlieue and starting to build up the narrative. And the issue is such that, 10 years ago when I wrote that within 20 years, France, if it was not serious about it, would be in a state of civil war like Lebanon in the 1970s, everybody laughed at me. But that's the case. The division now is such that when you go into school, when preschoolers go into school, the first thing they ask their fellow schoolmates is, what's your religion? Not what's your name, what's your religion?
And where does that come from? That just comes from parents judging like that?
It's been what is really strange is that the first generation of immigrants that came into France is in a way better integrated than the third generation. And the problem has to deal with, as I said, the banlieue being taken over by, as you said earlier, petty criminals. Now, the drug dealer is becoming the father figure, the role model, because you see him, driving this Mercedes, having all the girls he wants, and he's really the ones that you want to look up to. And that's the problem, that little nexus of the identity and building the victimization, as Marco mentioned. The fact that when you're asking a young kid at school, what's your nationality, they would answer, I'm Muslim. Not I'm French or I'm Algerian. I'm Muslim. That's my nationality. That's my identity. And so that has happened in the past 15 years. but it wasn't the case before. So we cannot say, look, it's been bad since immigrants have been coming to Europe after the 1945 war. No, it's not been the case. It's been now. And it's been specifically geared towards male, not female, when it comes to integration, because when you look at the pattern of the best grades in all the different categories, the one that have the best grades are female Muslims in France.
Mark, we've got less than a minute left, but is this just the future then for France, that they're going to have to accept there will be a series of these kind of attacks?
It's actually the future for a large part of the West and continental Europe in particular. I mean, and lone wolves in the U.S., not so much the organized attack. It's a new reality called the new status quo. It's a generational struggle we're talking about here. To undo this mindset is going to take a very long time.
Thank you all for joining us on World Have You Say. I'm very grateful to you. A real insight into that topic. We, of course, are back at the same time tomorrow. If you've got any comments, of course, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter. We're on the hashtag WHYS. And you can, of course, sign up for our podcast. If you search for it in your search engine, you will find us. Speak to you again tomorrow.